Hello, and welcome to the procurement processes based on the 2 CFR sections 200.318 to 200.327 orientation. For today's agenda, we will cover a small introduction of the topic, all related administrative orders, the requirements for the 2 CFR 200.318 to 200.327 sections, and other provisions. The Procurement Division welcomes you to this introduction session to the procurement processes for the CDBG-DR program in order to emphasize the most important parts of the procurement processes. The Puerto Rico Department of Housing has been designated by the government of Puerto Rico as the agency responsible for managing the funds of the Puerto Rico Block Grant Program for Community Development Disaster Recovery. Under program administration, PRDOH will use its own procurement procedures in accordance with applicable local, state, and federal laws while maintaining the principles of full and open competition as established in the 2 CFR section 200.317. Subrecipients shall be governed by the provisions of the 2 CFR sections 200.318 to section 200.327. The general principles for CDBG-DR procurement processes are competitive methods. It's a requirement for all procurement processes. Open and full competition, which is also a requirement for all procurement processes. Compliance with requirements in the 2 CFR sections 200.318 to 200.327. Acquisitions made by subparticipants shall be carried out in compliance with the requirements set out in these sections. And cost reasonableness. The cost or price for the goods or services to be purchased must be reasonable. As part of PRDOH efforts to accelerate disaster recovery processes and in order for CDBG-DR funds to reach program participants quickly in a timely and effective manner, Administrative Orders 2120 and 2127 were issued, dated April 14th and April 28th, 2021, respectively. It made it permissible for all CDBG-DR subrecipients to use the provisions of the 2 CFR 200.318 to 2 CFR 200.327 in their procurement procedures in relation to CDBG-DR programs. These administrative orders exempt all subrecipients from compliance with the procurement manual for the CDBG-DR program, regulation number 9205. Procurement processes carried out by the subrecipients shall be carried out in accordance with the provisions laid down in the 2 CFR sections 200.318 to 200.327. And procurement processes that were published prior to the date of administrative orders will continue under the processes set out in Regulation 9205. As for the general procurement standards in the 2 CFR 200.318, maintain written policies and procedures consistent with standards set out in the 2 CFR sections 200.318 to 200.327. Check the good performance of contractors in accordance with the terms, conditions, and specifications of their contracts. Maintain written standards of conduct that cover organizational conflicts of interests and conflict of interest with the staff involved in the selection, award, and administration of a contract. Make interagency agreements when appropriate to foster economy and efficiency. Competition requirements must be met and documented. Also, Contracts should only be awarded to responsible contractors who have the ability to provide goods or perform services in accordance with the terms and conditions of the acquisition. Contractor integrity, performance history, and financial and technical resources will be considered. Time and material contracts can be used, but only if no other contract is determined to be appropriate. This type of contract shall include not to exceed ceiling price that the contractor will exceed at his own risk. The acquiring entity will be responsible for good administrative practice and sound business judgment for the settlement of all contractual and administrative issues arising out of procurements. As for the competition, any acquisition, whether of goods and or services, shall be made in a manner that offers full and open competition. Contractors drafting specifications, requirements, scopes of work, invitations to bid, or requests for proposals must be excluded from competing in such acquisitions. And written procedures must be in place for any acquisition. Written procedures must ensure that all solicitations provide a clear and accurate description of the technical requirements of the good or service to be purchased. Where necessary, it shall establish the minimum characteristics to which the good or service must be adjusted in order to meet the need. The inclusion of a brand name will be allowed to define performance or product type and other requirements if a note is included indicating that it is the brand or an equivalent. And all requirements to be met by bidders and all factors to be used in the bid evaluation must be identified. Situations that restrict competition are the following. Impose unreasonable requirements to qualify bidders. Require unnecessary experience and excessive bonding. Non-competitive pricing practices between bidders or between affiliated companies. Non-competitive contracts for consultants who are under long-term contracts. Organizational conflicts of interests. Specify only one brand product instead of allowing an equal product to be offered that includes a description of the essential characteristics of the product or service so that competition is not restricted, and any arbitrary action in the recruitment process. Geographical preferences should not be used in the evaluation of offers or proposals except when applicable federal statutes expressly require or encourage geographic preference. Services are subject to state licenses. And in the case of architecture and engineering services, geographical preference may be used provided that its use does not prevent the qualification of an adequate number of qualified participants. To ensure competition, the acquiring entity will maintain up-to-date pre-qualified lists, including sufficient qualified bidders. And the list of qualified persons, firms, and/or products is allowed. Acquisition methods are divided between informal and formal. The simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000 or below. This amount is subject to change at the federal government's discretion. Informal acquisitions, where the acquisition of goods or services does not exceed the $250,000. These include micro purchases and small purchases. As for the formal acquisitions, they are those in which the acquisition of goods and/or services exceeds the $250,000. Documented processes and advertising are required in these cases, and these include sealed bids, requests for proposals, and non-competitive processes. The latter do not require publicity. Micro purchases. Acquisition of goods and/or services does not exceed $10,000. It may be awarded without requesting quotes if the price is determined to be reasonable based on research, experience, purchase history, or other information. As for small purchases, acquisitions of goods and/or services between $10,001 and $250,000. The price or tariff quotes must be obtained from an appropriate number of qualified sources. In both cases, to the extent possible, it should be distributed equally among qualified suppliers. Sealed bidding, invitation for bids. Bids are publicly requested, and a fixed price contract, a lump sum or unit price, is awarded to the responsible bidder whose bid, in accordance with all the material terms and conditions of the invitation for bids, is the lowest cost. For the sealed bidding to be feasible, the following conditions must be met. There are complete, adequate, and realistic specifications. 2 or more responsible bidders are willing to compete, and the contract will be made through a fixed price contract, and the selection will be made mainly based on the price. The following requirements apply to sealed biddings. Offers must be requested from an appropriate number of qualified sources. Sufficient response time must be provided before the date set for the opening of bids. The invitation for bids must be publicly announced. The invitation for bids shall include these specifications and shall define the articles or services for the bidder to respond adequately. All bids shall be opened at the time and place prescribed in the invitation for bids and shall be opened publicly. A fixed price contract will be awarded to the responsive and responsible bidder with the lowest bid, and any or all offers may be rejected if there is a reliable and documented reason. The requirements for competitive proposals are as follows. They should be published and must identify all evaluation factors and their relative importance. They must be solicited from an adequate number of qualified proponents. They must have a written method for conducting technical assessments of the proposals received and making selections. Qualification. Qualification-based selection is permitted in the acquisition of professional architecture and/or engineering services. In this process, the qualifications of the bidder are evaluated, and the most qualified bidder is selected, subject to the negotiation of fair and reasonable compensation. The method in which the price is not used as a selection factor can only be used in the contracting of professional, architecture, and engineering services. It may not be used for the purchase of other types of services. Contracts must be awarded to the responsible proposal whose proposal is most advantageous, considering price and other factors. Acquisition through non-competitive procurements may only be used when applying one or more of the following circumstances. Acquisition of properties or services which total dollar amount does not exceed the micro purchase threshold, which is $10,000. The item is available only from a single source. The public demand or emergency for the requirement will not allow the delay resulting from the advertising of a competitive solicitation. The Federal Contracting Agency expressly authorizes the acquisition by non-competitive proposal in response to a written request. After the responses are solicited from various sources, it is determined that competition is inadequate. Hiring small businesses and minority-operated businesses, women-operated companies, MWBE, and businesses in areas with surplus labor. Affirmative steps should be taken to ensure the participation of small businesses, minority-operated businesses, women-operated businesses, and labor surplus area firms whenever possible. The affirmative action steps are the following. Include qualified small and minority enterprises and women businesses in distribution call lists. Ensure that small and minority enterprises and women businesses are called upon whenever they are potential sources. Divide total requirements where economically feasible into smaller tasks or quantities to allow maximum participation of small and minority enterprises and women businesses. Establish delivery times where requirements allow that encourage the participation of small and minority businesses and women companies. Use the services and assistance as appropriate of organizations such as the Small Business Administration and the Department of Commerce's Minority Business Development Agency. And when subcontracts are to be held, require the prime contractor to meet the first 5 affirmative steps of this list. State agencies or an agency of a state political subdivision and its contractors are required to strictly comply with Section 6002 of the Solid Waste Disposal Act, as amended by the Conservation and Resource Recovery Act. For each procurement process exceeding $250,000, including changes to contracts, a cost or price analysis must be performed. The method and degree of analysis will depend on each particular situation, so it will be on a case-by-case basis. Independent estimates must be made before receiving offers or proposals. The profit must be negotiated as a separate element of the price for each contract in which there is no price competition and in all cases where cost analysis is performed. The use of cost contracts plus percentage of costs and percentage of construction is prohibited. Any contract or subcontract for the construction or improvement of installations exceeding $250,000 shall meet the following minimum requirements. A bid guarantee for each bidder equivalent to 5% bid price. A contractor performance bond for 100% the price of the contract. And a contractor payment bond for 100% the price of the contract. Contracts must contain the provisions found in Part 2 CFR Part 200 Appendix 2. The contracting entity shall verify and document the eligibility of the suppliers in the following databases: System of Award Management and Limited Denial of Participation List. Federal Register 6066 N01 requires to clearly state the period of performance or date of completion in all contracts, the incorporation of performance requirements and liquid damage in each procured contract, and the creation of a summary list of procurement processes that includes the phase of the procurement, requirements for proposals, and any liquid damages associated with a contractor's failure or inability to implement the contract, which must be published on the program's website. If you shall have any additional questions, please contact the following people: Licenciado William Rios Maldonado, Licenciada Laura Pagan Santana, Licenciada Catherine Chacón Ramírez, or Licenciado Efrén Marrero Negrón. They are all part of the Procurement Division of PRDOH.